In this lesson on the American Revolution, we will be looking at the final years of the American Revolution, in which the British switched their strategy from fighting in the north around Philadelphia and New York City to a southern strategy. And this change in strategy does not benefit them. And ultimately, in the end, an entire British army is forced to surrender, and the United States gains its independence from Great Britain. The big idea is that the war spread to the south, where the British were finally defeated. Main ideas: Patriot forces faced many problems in the war in the south. The American patriots finally defeated the British at the Battle of Yorktown. The British and the Americans officially ended the war with the Treaty of Paris of 1783. All right, before we get to the rest of the lesson, I have here a big confusing map showing this switch of British priorities from the north to the south. But before we even get into that southern fighting, what we need to talk about, as briefly as I can make it, is the situation around the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Because what happens around Philadelphia really has an awful lot to do with this shift in strategy. In 1777, the capital of the United States is Philadelphia. The British general that has troops in New York City, General Howe, uh, is given orders by General Burgoyne up in Canada to take part in an offensive that would cut off the New England colonies from the remainder, and by so doing, as previously mentioned in another lesson, effectively cut the head off of the snake. Separate the New England colonies from the rest, cut the head off of the snake, and the body will die. The revolution will end without leadership from the New England colonies, particularly Massachusetts. Burgoyne launches his offensive from Canada southward. Part of his offensive goes down the Hudson River Valley, heading south towards Albany, New York, and another part of his offensive launches an attack from the west towards Albany, but is stopped at the Battle of Oriskany. Uh, the third prong of the attack is supposed to come from New York City. General Howe is supposed to head north up the Hudson River and meet up with General Burgoyne at Albany and cut the New England colonies off from the west. But as we learned previously, that's not what Howe does. General Howe launched his assault by loading all of his troops up on ships, heading up the Chesapeake Bay, and then marching overland towards Philadelphia. And General Burgoyne, of course, is defeated at the Battle of Saratoga, which convinces the French to declare war on Great Britain and come into the revolution on the side of the Americans. Uh, but it puts General Washington in a very bad position because he has to fight to try to defend Philadelphia here from the attacks that are being launched against it by General Howe. And in quick succession, Washington and the Continental Army are defeated at the battles of Germantown and Brandywine. And Washington then retreats to the north and west of Philadelphia, and he establishes a winter camp at Valley Forge. And the Continental Army under Washington has to brave the terrible winter of Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. But during that winter, they receive training from a Prussian military officer, Friedrich von Steuben, who trains. He does what's called training the trainer. He selects 100 of the best soldiers in the Continental Army and then trains them in the most up to date European tactics, including how to fight with bayonets. And then he sends these 100 men to train the soldiers of their various regiments. And by the time the Continental Army comes out of its winter camp at Valley Forge in the spring of 1779, it is an army that is capable of going toe to toe with the British and defeating them. And they prove this at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in June 1778. They don't actually defeat the British, but they drive the British off of the battlefield. The British abandon Philadelphia, and after Monmouth Courthouse, even though the British don't really lose the battle, they abandon the field of battle and leave it in Washington's hands. And this British army that had invested so much in capturing Philadelphia retreats back to New York, and there it remains. And so the British at this point realize, okay, this strategy isn't working. We have to do something else. And that is where we get to the Southern strategy in the Revolutionary War. Uh, Philadelphia now belongs to the United States again. The British Army is in New York. And a big part of that British Army, under the command of British General Lord Charles Cornwallis, loads up on ships in New York Harbor, and they sail down to South Carolina. And this is where we pick up on the actual Southern strategy. And we're gonna see the complicated map again, but we're not going to talk about Philadelphia anymore. So, Britain's Southern strategy. The British thought that there were more loyalists in the South, which there were. An awful lot of the South actually remained loyal to the British Crown. Southern resources were more valuable, therefore, they were worth preserving. And these resources included slaves, it included the products that came off of Southern plantations, particularly tobacco, rice, and indigo, which were very valuable in markets in Europe. Cotton was also being grown, but much less of it because cleaning cotton was a very labor intensive and you weren't going to get much value out of it. Value in cotton will come later. The British win a number of small victories, but they can't pacify the countryside, and this is largely their own fault. The way that the British conduct the war, even though they believe that there are more loyalists in the South, they tend to treat people in the South like enemies. They burn farms, they destroy crops in the field. Effectively, they take a population that was loyal to the king and they turn that population against the king by their own conduct in the fighting. And this is very similar to American failures in the Vietnam War nearly 200 years later. Uh, and it's similar to our own failures more recently in Iraq and Afghanistan. They had a good U.S. general. They had a bad one too. Horatio Gates, I will mention briefly, not the greatest general in the world, but they had a good general in Nathaniel Greene. And it's Nathaniel Greene's actions in the South that is going to turn the tide of war and give George Washington the opportunity to finally defeat the British in a large set piece engagement and make them know that the war for them is not a winnable thing. Back to the confusing, complicated map. So, two things happen here. First, Savannah, Georgia is captured in December 1778. This is months after the British are defeated. Well, not really defeated, but months after they are fought to a standstill at Monmouth Courthouse in between Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And in May 1780, Cornwallis leads a much larger invasion force to capture Charleston, South Carolina. It's Cornwallis's army that is going to be the main British fighting force in the South. And they will push inland from Charleston to engage the Continental Army under General Horatio Gates at Camden, South Carolina in August 1780, where Gates is not only is Gates roundly defeated, but the entire Southern Army is destroyed in the process. An entire American army is lost. And Cornwallis from Camden proceeds into deeper into South Carolina and part of North Carolina. There is fighting at Kings Mountain in October 1780, and this is where the British meet their first defeat in the South. Forces under Daniel Morgan fight against the British at the Kings Mountain. The British are harassed by a man who is known as the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion, and they're forced to push on. Even though they win the battle, they continue what is essentially a retreat. They are defeated again at the Battle of the Cowpens in January 1781 and continue to push out of the South. A battle that they have started to win the war is now becoming a giant retreat to get the heck out of there. And this is where Nathaniel Greene comes into play at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March 1781. Greene leads a new army of the South, and even though the fighting at Guilford is a defeat for the Americans, it doesn't matter because Cornwallis is desperate to get away from them. He retreats further to Wilmington, North Carolina, pursued all the way by Nathaniel Greene, and then retreats eventually into Virginia, where he will meet his ultimate fate. So, Patriot forces face many problems in the war. The war is not going well for the British in the North, as previously mentioned. The Americans have fought them to a standstill. They cannot win a decisive victory, so they set their sights on the South. They hope to find support from a large loyalist population in Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia. And they plan to free slaves and give them arms. And it's kind of interesting in that part of what makes the South valuable to the British are the enslaved population of Africans in the South. That's part of what makes it valuable. But at the same time, they have a plan to set slaves free and give them arms. And aside from the destruction of crops in the field, the burning of property, freeing of slaves turns the Southerners who were loyal to the king against the crown and pushes them into the rebel camp altogether. There's brutal fighting that takes place. The Patriots fought loyalists in direct combat in the South. Georgia fell to the British in December 1778, Charleston, South Carolina in May 1780. The Americans attacked the British in August 1780, and there's a number of defeats here, as previously mentioned when looking at the map, but they failed to drive them completely out of South Carolina. Nonetheless, the British retreat into North Carolina and then ultimately will retreat into Virginia. Uh, Many casualties are suffered on both sides. One of the main players here that actually helps to drive the British out of South Carolina into North Carolina, as mentioned before, is Francis Marion, also known as the Swamp Fox. He was more successful using guerrilla warfare against the British than Horatio Gates had been trying to engage them in a standard fight army to army at Camden, which had led to the destruction of an entire American army. His surprise attacks disrupt communication, disrupt supply lines, and force the British to retreat to areas where they can receive supplies from. And this is what is going to be their undoing. And here we are back to the confusing map again. So, as previously mentioned, fighting at Camden, an American defeat. You have the Battle of Kings Mountain, followed by the Battle of Cowpens, and the constant harassing by Francis Marion, Daniel Morgan, the fighting at Guilford Courthouse. Even though that is technically a British victory, they still retreat someplace where they can receive supplies, which is Wilmington, North Carolina, along the Cape Fear River. Uh, the whole campaign is just disintegrating, and the British kind of have themselves to blame for this. Focus question number one: in what ways did Patriot forces face many problems in the war in the South? Main idea two: the American Patriots finally defeat the British at the Battle of Yorktown. General Charles Cornwallis retreats from North Carolina into Virginia and finally establishes himself at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. Now, what is important about what happens at Yorktown actually doesn't happen anywhere near Yorktown. And that has to do with George Washington and what he desperately wants to do. Washington plans to attack New York City. New York is the scene of Washington's most humiliating defeat in the war, and he wants to take it back more than anything else in the world. After fighting the British at Monmouth Courthouse, Washington becomes obsessed with retaking New York City. Keep that in mind, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Washington's Continental Army and French troops under the Comte de Rochambeau march on Yorktown, Virginia instead. And the reason why is because Washington receives intelligence that Cornwallis has retreated to Yorktown. And even though Washington is desperate to launch an attack against New York City, he is talked out of attempting to do so. The commander of the French army in North America, Comte de Rochambeau, in a war council with George Washington and other members of Washington's staff, all of whom are against the idea of attacking New York City, Comte de Rochambeau talks Washington out of the idea. And Rochambeau's idea of this is that Cornwallis has retreated to Yorktown. If we attack New York, we're going to suffer massive casualties, and there's no guarantee that we're going to win the battle. It will be a useless, bloody conflict. But Cornwallis is out of supply. He's running away from Nathaniel Greene and Francis Marion and the others who were chasing him through out of North Carolina into Virginia. He's out of supply. He needs resupply. He needs his army of 8,000 men to be picked up and taken back to New York City. He's at Yorktown. We can trap him there. If we can trap Cornwallis at Yorktown and we can force him to surrender his army, we have a chance to end the war right now with a minimum of bloodshed. And George Washington is the kind of guy who can listen to advice from others and come to the conclusion that his original idea, it might be incorrect, that there might be a better way of doing things. And so he takes Rochambeau's advice. He takes the advice of other members of his staff, and they march south from New York City to Yorktown. So Washington decides to march on Yorktown, but he leaves men behind in New Jersey, and he does this to make the British think that he's going to continue to attack New York. So the British are convinced that Washington is going to attack New York City because he leaves a large number of men behind. The French army under Rochambeau and most of the Continental Army under Washington march south towards Yorktown, and the French Navy under the command of the Admiral Comte de Grasse sails north from the Caribbean Sea. Now, the British actually had a plan to attack that French Navy. And Washington learns of this plan because of a spy network that he established in New York City, way back in 1776. The spy network he named after his home county in Virginia. It was called the Culpeper Network. However, the leader of that network didn't like the name Culpeper, so he changed it to the Culper Network. And the Culper network of spies informed Washington of what was about to happen, that the French Navy was in danger. And so Washington continued to have troops demonstrate in front of New York City as though they were going to attack it. And the British Navy stayed in New York. The French Navy was saved. And because of this, the Comte de Grasse could sail north to blockade the Chesapeake Bay, keep the British Navy from evacuating Cornwallis's troops and trapping Cornwallis and the British Army at Yorktown. And here we have the map of the whole thing. So we've already talked about all this stuff in the South. Cornwallis marching north from Wilmington does a little dance here in Virginia, goes to Charlottesville, then to Richmond, ends up in Yorktown. Washington, way up here in front of New York City, convinced by Rochambeau not to attack the city, leaves troops behind to make it look like he's going to attack. And this keeps the British Navy at anchor in New York while he and Rochambeau and their armies, along with the Marquis de Lafayette, march on Yorktown and surround Cornwallis there. So, Battle of Yorktown. The Count de Rochambeau, that would be the French general, and the Admiral Comte de Grasse. These two guys, by the way, are brothers. Cornwallis traps himself at Yorktown. Washington and Rochambeau march down from Washington or from New York. Uh, the Comte de Grasse sails his fleet up here to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, and there's actually a battle between the British Navy and the French Navy here, and the French win. The French win the fight. The British squadron is forced to withdraw. Cornwallis is trapped, and this is where things take a turn for the worse. Cornwallis is forced to surrender at Yorktown, and the world is turned upside down. This tiny upstart rebellion, started by a bunch of farmers outside of Lexington, Massachusetts, has now come to, I guess, what you could call a final end. An entire British army of 8,000 men is forced to surrender to the combined forces of the French and the Americans. And when Cornwallis surrendered, he actually refused to surrender to Washington himself because he considered it a humiliation. He ordered one of his junior officers to offer the surrender to Washington, and since Washington would couldn't receive the surrender from Cornwallis, he was directed to surrender to a junior American officer. The British troops marched by in review to lay down their arms to surrender their weapons, and the British band struck up a song that was popular at the time in Great Britain called "The World Turned Upside Down," which is why I have that title in red there, upside down. And they refused to look at the Americans as they marched by. They refused even to look at the American flag. They instead marched by the French and looked towards the French and the French flag. And the Marquis de Lafayette, one of Washington's personal aides, who was in command of French troops that were there at the field, ordered his own band to strike up an American tune called Yankee Doodle. And the British at that point were kind of confused as what to do, because they can't look at the Americans because of the humiliation they've suffered, but they can't look at the French either because the French are playing an American song. So they marched and looked straight ahead and laid down their weapons, and 8,000 British soldiers surrendered. Focus question to number 2: how did the American patriots finally defeat the British at the Battle of Yorktown? Main idea 3: the British and the Americans officially end the war with the Treaty of Paris of 1783. After Yorktown, there were only a few small battles. The war was not over. Yorktown ended the major fighting, but there was still fighting that was going on over the next 2.5 years or so. The British lacked the money to pay for a new army, so they entered into peace talks with the Patriots. And the reason why they agreed to do this after all of this time fighting to hold on to their colonies was mostly because they had to consider the idea that the war would never end, that it could just keep going on and on and on like this forever. They already lost an entire army at Saratoga. Now they've lost an entire army at Yorktown. How much more are we willing to sacrifice to get what we want? Is it really worth the price that we have to pay? And the answer to that question was no. It was no longer worth it. The Treaty of Paris of 1783 officially ends the war in September 1783. It takes 2 years to come to a peace agreement. Not the least because the British really are not all that willing to do this, but they don't really have a choice. It's not worth continuing the fight. Britain formally recognizes American independence with the Treaty of Paris. It sets America's new borders, and the British accepted America's right to settle west of the original 13 colonies. One of the main things that was a cause of the American Revolution in the first place was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which had forbidden the colonists from moving westward into the Ohio River Valley. Some of the best farmland on earth. These people are mostly farmers, and farmers are always looking for more land. And the Ohio River Valley was some of the best farmland around, notwithstanding the fact that there were people living there already, Native Americans, who did not want settlers there. But the people in the colonies did not care, and now the people in the United States do not care. They're going to move out there anyway. So here we have a map of North America after the Treaty of Paris of 1783. The British give up their claims to the 13 colonies, but they also surrender their claims to everything from the Mississippi River eastward. The Spanish, because they fought in the war on the side of the Americans, the Spanish claim uh, this area here. The Spanish claim this, which will one day become the states of Mississippi, Louisiana, part of Alabama. Um, the Spanish claim it, the Americans claim it, and that's going to cause some dispute in the future. But again, that's a story for another day. But what the British have done effectively is they have surrendered everything west of the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. That's close to 500,000 square miles of land. This now is the United States effectively, even though the native tribes, especially here in the Northwest, that would be this area here, the Ohio River, which I'm very badly tracing, all of this area here, this is the Northwest Territory. This is where American settlers want to move. That's where they want to go. And unfortunately, there are people living there, and it's going to cause a great deal of conflict in the coming decades. Oops. All right. Focus question number 3. Describe how the British and the Americans officially ended the war with the Treaty of Paris of 1783. The essential question: explain why the war spread to the South, how the British were finally defeated, and the treaty that brought the war to an end.